One of the most remarkable films you can ever see, composed at the junction of film language development in the budding sound era, is Kenneth MacPherson's 1930 feature, Borderline. An expressionistic series of edits around subject and space mutely communicate their psychosomatic dimension. These edits illuminate the invisible psychological plane of recorded physical space. This film's production backstory is thoroughly fascinating, that is, the history of Kenneth MacPherson is. Of course, it is also worth sharing the history of Borderline's lead actor, Paul Robeson, who, like Charlie Parker, I received a vinyl decoration gift of. Noel Oakeshott claims it was one of a few records at some shop in the middle of New South Wales, and now Mr. Robeson looks at me as I'm using one of my computers. There he is. Kenneth MacPherson, along with Hilda Doolittle and Annie Ellerman, made up the Pool Group, based in Switzerland and dedicated to the publication of their artistic and literary ideas. This was primarily via their journal, Close Up, running for 10 issues from 1927 to 1933, as well as via multiple books, both novels and non-fiction. However, today the Pool Group is most known for their responsibility toward the creation of the film masterpiece Borderline. Now, Borderline was but one of 4 films the Pool Group produced during their existence, although Borderline appears to be the only one available, surviving intact into the present day. And to the best of my understanding, it was the only actual feature film of the 4. Kenneth MacPherson, born in Scotland in 1902, would eventually withdraw from film directing entirely after an apparently hostile critical reaction to Borderline upon its release in 1930. I see this as a great tragedy, as MacPherson was clearly a phenomenal pioneer of independent filmmaking, both by virtue of being there and first, but also in his employment of a completely new cinematographic grammar, a unique philosophy with which to visually communicate a narrative, independent or ignorant of an established Griffithian standard, if you will. It reminds me of Mark Rappaport's wholly original cinematographic philosophy on chain letters, partly defined by the then existence, in 1985, of handheld film cameras, a new world entirely from one wherein Max Ophuls was considered to command and encapsulate the technical palette of film production. One's ability to communicate or texture a narrative is dependent on whether they can visually tweak narrative proceedings in a certain way. Imagine MacPherson had handed over Borderline's direction to another, someone from Hollywood. An utterly different film would have been composed. The specificity of MacPherson's aesthetic is how Borderline manages to extract from its players' lives the psychosexual tensions bubbling underneath the surface. Having been made aware of Freudian theory and newer beliefs about human behavior, MacPherson attempted to communicate these new ideas in an authentic manner. His move to Switzerland an attempt to facilitate this, as he feared persecution from the British censors at that time. MacPherson's directorial career essentially ended after Borderline, although he is responsible for producing the phenomenal 1947 feature by Hans Richter, Dreams That Money Can Buy, which is also an extremely interesting title. And now let's talk a little bit about Paul Robeson. Robeson at this time had established himself as a serious theatre actor, and he was travelling abroad in England, performing in hit productions such as The Emperor Jones, Showboat, and Othello. He was accompanied by his wife Essie, who acted as his business manager and allegedly was the one to initially encourage Paul's acting career. Paul and Essie would co-star together as a married couple in Borderline. Essie's character, Ada, is having an affair with another man named Fawn, who is Caucasian. This depiction of a sexual relationship between two individuals of different racial heritage was extremely radical at this time. In general, the film's racial politics are intriguing. Paul Robeson's Pete Marond is depicted as a humble, hard-working man, thoroughly a positive portrayal, a man who is a humble victim of unfortunate circumstances. Ada is only human, however, and although never demonized, she appears to be earnestly in love with Fawn. Fawn himself is given to bouts of rage and irrationality, culminating in a consequential scuffle with his own wife, Astrid. There was a concerted attempt by MacPherson and the Pool Group to portray those of African descent in a certain way. This received a mixed response on set, apparently, as Essie writes in her published diary, Kenneth and HD used to make us so shriek with laughter with their naive ideas of Negroes that Paul and I often completely ruined our makeup with tears of laughter, had to make up all over again. I wonder to what degree this film was adjusted due to Paul and Essie's input. It was probably all the stronger for it. Paul Robeson was eager about engaging in experimental works of art around this time. His acting career in the United States had seen him engaging with the prolific Harlem Renaissance theatre scene, starring in works by Eugene O'Neill, and also appearing in some early silent films intended for African American audiences. Robeson was a true artist, interested in sincere expression. This was also indicative via his recorded music career, performing spirituals with his gifted bass baritone tenor. Borderline appears to be one of the most exploratory, forward-thinking works of art which Robeson engaged with, and it directly preceded his interest in certain radical politics and ideological anti-imperialism, arguably his most traditionally transgressive period, one which unfortunately preceded his troubles with McCarthy in the 1950s. Robeson was persecuted and treated as seditious due to his multiple political statements, some outright supporting the Soviet Union, others merely calling for African American emancipation. Even supporting the Soviet Union, however unfortunate and or ignorant that position might have been, was no grounds for the condemnation of individuals as traitors. They were sincere believers in what they saw as a just cause, rooted in a wholly legitimate labor and trade union movement within America itself, and yes, some of these people would be misled and or misguided by what would later turn out to be Soviet propaganda about the Russian Revolution ensuring an idyllic workers' paradise, or whatever they thought. During a major comeback tour in the later 50s and early 60s, Robeson wound up the apparently first major artist to perform at the construction site of Sydney's future Opera House, and whilst in Australia, he voiced his support for the rights of Indigenous Australians and is said to have played a major role in popularising and empowering this movement. More details of this are located in a link I will share in the description, a piece penned by one Anne Kerfoys. So Robeson, a fascinating figure in the history of 20th century art indeed. Borderline is so much more than a film starring Paul Robeson, though. It is a film made most memorable perhaps by MacPherson's photography, though likely steered, even saved, by Paul and Essie's input, or so I will presume here anyway. If anyone hasn't seen Borderline, I cannot recommend it enough. It will be one of the most interesting journeys that you embark upon during your film lifetime.